Why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to City Forum. I'm Michael Oden, and I'm the faculty coordinator of City Forum. And our student organizer is Brittany Faulkner, who does the lion's share of the work. For people who might be new visitors, City Forum is the kind of main event speaker series for the Community Regional Planning Program here at the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin. This is our first event of the spring term, of the spring semester. And we have a great lineup of speakers throughout the spring. But we're really kicking off City Forum with a bang this semester with Professor Edward Goetz, who is the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Professor Goetz is a very important national leader in scholarship and advocacy on fair housing issues, affordable housing issues, aspects of community development, and other issues related to inequality, discrimination, and inclusion in urban areas. And, I won't list his numerous books and articles. I think many, if not most, of the faculty here at Community Regional Planning use Ed's work in their classes. So many of you, those in the CRP program, probably are familiar with him or his work. But Professor Goetz' talk today will draw upon a very important and provocative article published last year in the Journal of the Journal of the American Planning Association with co-authors Rashad Williams and Anthony Damiano, and it's titled "Whiteness in Urban Planning." And this article really shifts our frame of reference and our frame of analysis about race, ethnicity, and power in U.S. urban areas. So it's a real privilege to have Professor Goetz here to talk about this very, very important work. So I'll turn it over to you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate that very kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm assuming now you can see a PowerPoint slide deck. So again, let me thank Michael and Brittany for the invitation to speak today. I will be talking about whiteness and urban planning, and as Michael noted, much of this is set out in this article that we had published last March in the Journal of the American Planning Association. I do want to acknowledge my co-authors, as Michael did, Rashad Williams and Tony Damiano. Rashad and Tony are PhD students at the Humphrey School, PhD students of mine in the Urban and Regional Planning program. And they really were very active co-authors on this in very important ways. I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the anonymous reviewers that helped shepherd this article through JAPA. This article began in a significantly different form than the way it ended up, and sometimes you come away from the peer review process with the feeling that the reviewers should have been co-authors as well, and I really do feel that way. To this day, I don't know who they are. I have suspicions, but don't know who they are, and am grateful to the contributions that they made to the article. So having said that, I think we begin by referencing the work that a lot of scholars in other disciplines have been doing, investigating and interrogating the idea of whiteness. And that's been happening for a few decades now in sociology, in geography, and we borrow heavily from those ideas. I think our first main point, however, is that those ideas, this word about whiteness, hasn't really reached the planning profession too much, outside of some planning theoreticians and some planning historians. But in the mainstream of our curriculum for urban planning, and in the mainstream of scholarship about contemporary urban issues, we don't really see this idea of whiteness. And that's not to say, of course, that that urban planning doesn't deal with race, right? I mean, we deal with race in a very central manner in housing and transportation and environment, et cetera. But the way we have dealt with race hasn't really centered whiteness. And I would frankly point to my own career as a case in point. I've been writing about race when I write about housing for 30 years or so, and I've written about how race has interfered with regional approaches to affordable housing, both here in the Twin Cities, but also elsewhere, how it's an obstacle to this needed kind of progressive policy solution. I've written about how race has produced distorted outcomes of wealth and prosperity in American cities, how it's overlapped with poverty, how it influenced and still influences public housing policy and public housing demolition. I think the way that I have dealt with race in my writing and my analysis has been fairly typical, and it leads to a couple of things that are actually problematic. First is the notion that race is equated with the situation and conditions of Black and brown people, but not white people. So, you go back 100 years and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about the Negro problem, and others wrote about the Negro problem. No one wrote about the white problem. No one conceptualized the white problem at that time. When we talk about the urban ghettos of the mid-20th century, we are thinking about communities of color. When we think about the no-go zones of the 1980s, we're thinking about areas of habitation by people of color. We think about and the federal government insists that local governments analyze what they call racially concentrated areas of poverty. And these are non-white areas. In fact, think about that for a second. Think about this term, racially concentrated areas of poverty. This is a term of art that the federal government uses. And what is the definition of it? The definition of it, in part, is any place that has fewer than 50% white people and more than 40% people in poverty. The notion here that racial concentration only exists when there are too few white people around, right? The threshold is the number of people of color, as though race isn't something that actually applies to white people. You can have 80, 90% white people in a community, but the federal government does not consider that racially concentrated. So So this notion of race then is too frequently sort of applied only to BIPOC populations. And we see that, I think, in a lot of the analysis in urban planning. Here I've pulled from a recent publication that describes segregation and analyzes segregated communities. And I think this graph is kind of typical of this point as well. Here you have a depiction of the black-white segregation up at the top, Hispanic white and Asian white. And there, it allows us to examine at a glance, wow, blacks are much more highly segregated in the US than are Asians. Hispanics fall somewhere in the middle. The reference point is always the white population. But we don't see a line for whites here, right? And if we did see a line for whites, and you can argue whites are embedded in all of these lines, and that's true, but we don't have a separate line for whites, which would lead us to the realization that, in fact, whites are the most segregated racial group in the United States. Instead, they sort of are the normative background on this chart, but also more generally, the normative background for what we regard as the problematic patterns that apply to blacks or to Hispanics, et cetera. And I think probably the last thing that sort of emerges from the way that urban planning has addressed the issue of race, and again, I would implicate myself in this, is that we end up treating racial problems as defects in an otherwise functioning liberal democratic tradition, egalitarian leaning tradition of American politics and American economic conditions, and that these are unfortunate sort of problems that we have, that these are conditions that need to be solved so that we can sort of realize that greater egalitarian and liberal democratic tradition that we like to associate with American life. And so I've come to believe over the time in recent years that this is really fundamentally incorrect, that all of this is fundamentally incorrect. And that treating race the way we have in much urban planning scholarship is to misunderstand the fundamentals of of US society. It is to obscure the acknowledgement that racial injustice, of course, applies to the conditions of BIPOC populations, but that racial injustice also bestows unfair advantages and wealth upon whites. And that's the part that goes uninvestigated too often. So the work of these scholars in sociology and geography, and the work of philosophers such as Charles Mills, Tommy Shelby, and others, argue that these outcomes, these racial problems that we have, are not really malfunctions of a egalitarian leaning society, but they are in fact the designed outcomes of a fundamentally racist, and more specifically, white supremacist society. So, the phrase white supremacy can engender a number of responses, from eye rolling to sort of knee-jerk reactions that suggest obvious hyperbole on the part of the person who has uttered the phrase. And that's because for the last 50 or 60 years, the phrase white supremacy has really been reserved for describing the actions and the beliefs of radical white fringe nationalists, actors who are outside of the norm, um, the attitudes and ideas of extremists, and that is unfortunate because I think prior to that, white supremacy and what we argue for and what others have been arguing for is a use of the term to describe systemic and enduring dynamics of racial subjugation and hierarchy that have operated and continue to operate across all sectors of US society, and a system that intersects with capitalism and patriarchy, two other forms of dominance and oppression in various manners. And by centering whiteness, we better see this more systemic pattern of white supremacy. And we argue in the paper, we better understand US cities. And finally, we can intervene better in those issues where we want to make changes. So let me take an example from housing, which is my area of research expertise, to sort of quickly sort of go through this process a little bit. I'll do it in housing because I'm more familiar with that, but I think that you can do the same for transportation, for environment, for land use, for the other domains of urban planning. And in fact, in this past semester at the University of Minnesota, Rashad Williams and I co-taught a course on the city of white supremacy, where we did this across various domains of urban planning to talk about how understanding this as manifestations of white supremacy helps evolve a better set of solutions. But I want to sort of demonstrate again how we could be thinking about race and how that leads us to fall short of how I think we ought to be thinking about it. We could look, for example, at the development of Black codes and Jim Crow laws in the late 19th and early 20th century, and we could interpret these as the unfortunate betrayal of the promise of racial equity that we saw in the Civil War and in Reconstruction, right? We can see this as an unfortunate outcome. We fell short of Reconstruction goals. We fell short of truly initiating and instigating the 40 acres and a mule kind of equality and reparations. We can consider racial zoning as a perversion of land use controls that was used really to serve, a few isolated, regressive, and repressive local regimes. After all, not all places practiced racial zoning, although several did. And we can note that the Supreme Court of the United States fairly quickly struck down racial zoning after it was brought to them. And so we can think of it again as an aberration. We can move from that aberration to the next aberration, racially restrictive deeds, and we can think of those as unscrupulous and deplorable developments of bad intentioned real estate operators, real estate industry that may have been dominated by folks with bad intentions. But we can note that it was corrected out of existence by the Supreme Court in 1948 in Shelley versus Kramer, just like racial zoning was corrected out of the system by the Supreme Court ruling in Buchanan versus Worley. We can look at Holk redlining and suggest that it was the outcome of some unsophisticated social science in the first half of the 20th century, when association was often taken for causation, and the leading scholarly minds in the real estate analysis industry advised the US government in ways that we now realize were unwise. And it led to this system of rating communities for investment opportunities that were largely, almost exclusively based on race and ethnicity. And we can see that as a problem that was corrected as well. We can look at white flight. We can look at central city decline and disinvestment. We can look at these as economic and demographic patterns, as kinds of trends in American life. Some even race neutral. We can look at exclusionary zoning and NIMBYism. We can look at them as in the same way as we did racial zoning, as unfortunate distortions of a fundamentally legitimate power of land use control and local determination, right? We can look at concentrated poverty as an unfortunate but unintended consequence of the Fair Housing Act, right? That's what William Julius Wilson in part argued, that by eliminating discrimination in housing, or at least making it unlawful in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, what we did was to allow the Black middle class to leave central city ghettos, and what they left behind was concentrated poverty. So it was this unintended outcome, not only of demographic changes, but unintended outcome of an egalitarian impulse in public policy. And we can look at it as the impersonal kind of outcomes of economic restructuring of the 1970s and the 1980s, which was also part of Wilson's explanation of that. And finally, we can look at predatory lending in this light as well. We can look at it and not see race. Certainly, if we ascribe it to economic predation only, predation of unsophisticated home loan borrowers, and itself a byproduct of a fundamentally egalitarian impulse, a progressive, a benevolent impulse of trying to spread home ownership more widely in the population, trying to get it into communities where it didn't exist before. And that's what led to the relaxing of loan terms, et cetera, right? So it's possible to look at this history, this roughly 130-year history of housing. And actually what I haven't mentioned is also the violence and intimidation of American housing history over this period of time. And we can look at that also as episodic, periodic, but not systemic in some ways. But the question is, when do we stop? When do we stop and look at that list and realize that this entire history, this entire 130-year history, was not the pattern, was not the reality, was not the baseline itself, right? That the moments of racial benevolence, the moments of real progress in racial justice, that those were in fact the exceptions to the rule, that they were the distortions of a system that works fundamentally in the opposite direction, a system that works fundamentally to create, to maintain, and to reinforce racial hierarchy. That these examples that I provided aren't examples of the system that is broken. This is the set of examples of how the system works. of how the system is fundamentally designed, right? We talk about the Supreme Court eliminating racial zoning, but the map that I showed you was the city of Birmingham's 1926 map. Buchanan versus Worley, the Supreme Court decision, was decided 9 years before that. Racial zoning persisted in some cities into the 40s and into the 50s. Racially restrictive deeds were outlawed by Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, but one of the examples that I showed on my slide was from a new subdivision built outside of Minneapolis in 1951, 3 years after Shelley versus Kramer. And restrictive deeds were part of US government policy, right? This was part of the FHA policy, and was recommended to the private sector as the best way of doing business. And this violence and intimidation that we talk about as episodic really is better understood as one of the great grassroots movements in American society in the 20th century. When you look at race riots, at residential bombings, at lynchings, white capping, you look at the Tulsa riot of 1921, the Chicago riots. The Tulsa riot was an attempt to make the city of Tulsa a sundown town, a town where Blacks are not welcome at night. In Chicago, between 1919 and 1928, there were 58 residential bombings, one every 20 days over a 3.5-year period. Fast forward 20 years later, Chicago between 1949 and 1959 saw 3 bombings, 10 arsons, 11 arson attempts, 81 other incidents of racial terrorism. That's one every 10 days over a 3-year period, right? This is sustained behavior and sustained phenomena over the 20th century. When we stop and realize that, and when we think of this as the system, as the process, I would argue this allows us to discover whiteness and the basic dynamics of whiteness. And the importance of whiteness. And in the article, we argue that there are 4 essential elements of whiteness. It's all too frequent invisibility, the fact that whiteness operates as exclusion, that it is valuable, that it conveys value to those who can claim membership, and that it is durable, it is resilient. And I'll try to take the rest of my time to briefly try to describe these a little bit more. But in terms of the invisibility of whiteness, I think there are many ways that this occurs and this manifests itself. And again, as I would say, we do this even as we are well-intentioned about describing the inequalities related to race in the United States. So one of my favorite concepts comes from David Rusk, the former mayor of the city of Albuquerque, who became a sort of policy wonk after leaving that position, wrote a couple of books, and he used the phrase the segregation tax to describe the fact that house wealth accumulates much more slowly in communities of color than it does in white communities. That is, property appreciates more quickly for whites than it does for non-whites, for white communities than it does for non-white communities. And so that people of color tend to pay this segregation tax, this metaphorical tax, right? It's wealth that they don't realize because of segregation in the United States. And I think this is a useful concept. But it itself obscures whiteness, right? What if Rusk had termed this the segregation dividend and focused instead on the unfair accumulation of wealth in white communities relative to other communities, right? It shifts the focus. It shifts the analytic lens that we use for thinking about race. And it surfaces, I would say, unfair advantage just as much as, which is needed just as much as understanding unfair disadvantage. Opportunity neighborhoods, I think, is a way of talking about white neighborhoods without using the word white. And opportunity neighborhoods, that's the big paradigm in urban planning and in housing policy these days. And I think it serves the same sort of obscuring function, especially as we think about moving people to opportunity. We know very well what we mean by that. Where are those people moving from, and where are they moving to? It's all very clear to us in racial terms, even though we don't talk about it in racial terms. Racially concentrated areas of poverty obscure whiteness as well by focusing on one end of the segregation continuum and ignoring the other end, right? If segregation is a continuum from all white to all other, the racially concentrated area of poverty is a focus on the all other aspect to the detriment of any analysis of the other end of the spectrum. And again, all of this serves to establish whiteness as the unexamined baseline, as the unexamined norm of American community life. Whiteness, which is everywhere, but simultaneously hard to see. I added the last bullet there, whether to suggest that the invisibility of whiteness might be historically contingent, because I think this invisibility is an argument much more difficult to make over the last 4 or 5 years than it was in the previous 30, 40, 50 years. And I think that the election of a African-American as president and white backlash and the growth of a white political consciousness over the first 15, 20 years of this century suggests that invisibility of whiteness is something that might be historically contingent and was a bit more dominant than it is right now, when whites are organizing around their whiteness. But this leads anyway. This notion of the invisibility of whiteness leads us to argue for planners to center whiteness. I'm going to have to go a little more quickly through the other three. Sorry. Whiteness as exclusion. We think about opportunity hoarding, the notion that whiteness as a category by definition excludes others. Whiteness doesn't exist without others who can't be considered white. It is a category that is defined in relation to others. But we think about exclusion from policy benefits. We write in the paper, again, as others have written before us, about the exclusion of people of color from the great working class victories of the New Deal, the early 20th century New Deal victories for labor, for Social Security, for pensions, all of these economic rights basically bypassed people of color in the way that they were implemented, or in the fact that they excluded farm workers and domestic workers, et cetera. We can look at the GI Bill of Rights, what some people argue did more to create the American middle class than any other act of government, but it was implemented in such a way as to be focused on whites. We look at exclusion in zoning and redlining, et cetera. The third important aspect of whiteness is that it does have a value. We quote one analyst is calling whiteness an efficiently functioning racial cartel that monopolizes social and economic advantages. And all one needs to do is look at the racial wealth gap in the United States and its permanence over time, and how that is derived from differences in home ownership and the wealth that is derived from home ownership. The differential rates of value appreciation in white neighborhoods compared to others that I've talked about. Mortgage lending gaps, how whites are approved for mortgages at rates many times those of other groups, even whites of lower income, right? There's the whites without a high school education are approved for loans at rates that are well above African Americans with college education, et cetera. We have gaps in education. We have gaps in incarceration. All of these produce and reinforce material wealth differences across racial lines. But the value of whiteness goes beyond material value. There is status value. There is psychological value. One can look at gaps in health and disease related to stress and related to psychological stress of poverty and of being a non-white person in the United States. The last element that we focus on is the durability of whiteness. This is the essential element that suggests that whiteness is indeed a kind of system of oppression. The history that I recounted in housing is really a history of one innovation after another aimed at establishing and maintaining racial domination, right? It's the movement, it's the quick shift from racial zoning. Well, that's outlawed. We can shift to out and out violence. We can shift to deed restrictions. When deed restrictions are outlawed, we can shift to exclusionary zoning. We can shift from that to predatory lending. Right? These are new and adaptive ways of continuing the same form of racial hierarchy and subjugation, new ways to accomplish old objectives. You can even look at what we regard as the great accomplishments of the civil rights era, right? And I've listed Brown versus the Board of Education and the Fair Housing Act of 1968, two of the landmark accomplishments of the mid-20th century civil rights. But of course, Brown versus the board was followed immediately by the second Brown decision, which said, well, yeah, we do have to desegregate schools, but we're going to do it with all deliberate speed, which was, of course, immediately interpreted and in fact meant as the speed at which whites will tolerate desegregation. The Fair Housing Act was enacted, but it was significantly hampered by a whole set of compromises, most notable of which was the Mrs. Murphy exemption, which allowed 1 to 4 unit buildings where the owner occupied one of the units to be exempt from the provisions of the anti-discrimination provisions of the act itself, named after the fictional widower, Mrs. Murphy, who shouldn't be forced to live with people she didn't want to live with. So whiteness is durable, and the advantages of whiteness are durable. And whiteness has a value, which we need to understand and acknowledge. Whiteness operates as exclusion, and we can see it in lots of different ways in American urban areas. And whiteness is too frequently not interrogated explicitly in the kind of work that urban planners do. And so we argue that a whiteness framework could mean something important for urban planning. It could mean something for urban planning research. It could mean something for the practice of urban planning. And we hope that it makes its way into the education of planners in a more systematic way. And I think it's happening already. As I mentioned, our article appeared 3 months before George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and set off a new round of activism on issues of racial justice in the United States. And so we see that happening. We see the emergence of what some people are calling abolitionist planning. Shortly before our article was written, Justin Steele, a professor at MIT, wrote articles on anti-subordination planning, which aligns closely with our thinking. Rashad Williams, my co-author, after our article, published an article in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, where he talked about a meaningful reparative planning approach. Tony Damiano and Rashad and I have published another article where we talk about racially concentrated areas of affluence. This is our sort of response to the federal government's focus on racially concentrated areas of poverty. We're trying to shine a light on predominantly white and wealthy areas, and arguing for them as a topic of interest and consideration, not just by researchers, but by local governments. And I got to tell you, one of the best things that ever happened in my career just happened last month when officials at the state of California, their Department of Housing and Community Development, called and said they wanted to incorporate racially concentrated areas of affluence into their policy framework, and they wanted to make local governments in California incorporate them into their fair housing analysis. It is not often, I will speak for myself only on this, but it is not often when a university researcher sees someone who actually makes policy incorporate their ideas. It's good to see. I would like, of course, I think, to see more of that happen. We can think about disparity analysis, racial disparity analysis. We already think about issues such as value capture. What if we applied value capture to the racial dividend, to the segregation dividend? If we thought of the wealth that an entire generation of white families were able to accumulate, that a generation of Black and Hispanic families did not accumulate? What if we thought of that as value that was realized as a result of a set of government policies that made those areas more valuable and protected that value? What does that do to our notion of value capture? Cities and states have already started to rethink single-family zoning as a way of protecting whiteness and the prerogatives and the privileges of whiteness. And maybe that's changing as well. So I have spoken for close to 45 minutes, and I would leave it at this. I think that many of the things that we talked about in terms of what this framework could mean are being considered, and I think somewhat accelerated because of the post George Floyd environment that we see in a lot of cities across the country. So I do hold out hope for it, while at the same time holding a healthy skepticism that for the adoption of an explicit white framework to the entire range of things that urban planners do. But I do think that there is an acknowledgement, and perhaps a growing acknowledgement, that the field of planning has been complicit in a lot of this activity over the last 100 years or so, and that perhaps there's a role for the profession in amending that moving forward. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and invite questions or invite comments from Michael or anyone.
Oh, yeah, well, let me just open it up. If people have a question, raise your little whatever emoji hand, or just, now, Greg.
Hey, thank you for being here. So, I read just as recently as today an incoming planning commissioner for the city of Austin saying, we have all the housing units we need, and housing costs are going up simply because of, basically greedy people coming in and trying to invest too much. And we are still the fastest growing city in the country. We have a strategic housing blueprint identifying tens of thousands of missing housing units. Like, how do we get away from the whole, let's not be so afraid of new housing, and let's allow for responsible land development and legalize housing in more ways?
Yeah. I think the notion that we have all the housing we need comes from a fairly simplistic comparison of two numbers, right? Number of households and number of units, without looking at affordability, to be able to sort of identify extreme shortages in some parts of the market that aren't being served by development that serves other parts of that market. And I think you've touched on a topic that has some currency around the country these days about the impact of new development, the need for new development, and whether that's going to meet housing needs. And so there's the debate that you've identified, and then there's the debate once you agree that new units are needed, whether building at market rates are going to address the deficits that exist in the market as well. So I think that you respond through more careful analysis. I think that that most housing planners now understand that and are trying to get around those kind of simplistic formulas that you were that you had mentioned, and it's something that needs to be kept at the forefront.
Other questions? Brittany, could you keep track of the chat and see if?
Yes, we already have one question. So from our own Dr. Wilson, she asks, how might we reframe the far right white movement as a minority working class struggle that we have not paid attention to?
Right. That's a good question, and might be a question I've asked myself as well. I think that there's so I don't know how to effectively do that. I do know that there are counter arguments, right? I think that the white working class has not been the only group left behind by policies over the last 30, 40 years. I think that's probably worth pointing out as a starter. Second, I think that it's also worth noting that that the far right white movement is not entirely a working class movement as well, and that a good deal of the support that has fueled the far right movement has been from other echelons of society. And so to think of it as only a working class movement is also incorrect in those ways. And so I just think that kind of response, that kind of analysis needs to continue being surfaced and referenced in response to this.
Other questions? Any other questions? There must be. Liz?
Okay, I had to raise my blue hand, sorry. Hi, Ed, thanks for coming.
Yes.
I think this is really interesting and really important for us to think about, the way we're framing things. And I know you probably saw, and I know you wrote a response to David Ambrosio's recent piece where he's, I think, basically, I haven't read the article, I just read the shelter force thing, and I think he's basically saying, oh, the politics of this would be too hard. It'd be too hard to kind of go after, white exclusion or areas that have built up the benefit of whiteness in terms of property value and other things. And I just wonder what thoughts you have about kind of how you start to reframe this conversation in a context where you have a status quo that operates a certain way, and where the politics, the resistance to thinking about reparative justice or value capture that incorporates the racial dividend and things like that. Like, I guess I'm asking what you think about starting points, and
Right.
How do you respond to someone who says, oh, that's too much, that would just, raise so much resistance.
Right. Thanks for asking that question. First of all, and thanks in no small part because it allows me an excuse to trash David's recent work in that area. And let me say, I use that sort of jokingly. David Ambrosio is a good friend of mine. I have over my career agreed with almost everything he's written. I strongly disagree with his most recent article suggesting that efforts to dismantle exclusionary zoning are wrong-headed. His argument is, as you describe, Liz, in part based on the fact that it would be difficult and perhaps not worth it. It's also based on his argument that exclusionary zoning, that anti-exclusionary zoning is a kind of form of deregulation, which makes it a kind of neoliberal response. And that, it strikes me, is fundamentally wrong. I think that the people who argue for dismantling exclusionary zoning are not calling for the abolition of zoning altogether. They are calling for the replacement of exclusionary zoning with different types of zoning. That is not deregulation, that is re-regulation. David also argues that NIMBYism and exclusion is the prerogative of local governments, and to try to override it is akin to those state preemption laws that don't allow local governments to do what they want to do. This is yet another absurdity of his argument, that this is preemption in any way. When we try to dismantle exclusionary zoning, we are not removing the right of zoning from local governments. We are not removing local land use powers. He references the permit override programs in some states as a form of exemption or preemption, which they are patently not. And then finally, he argues it's anti-local democracy in some ways, that there's something legitimate about exclusion and NIMBYism simply because they are expressions of local preference, as though our systems of white supremacy haven't been enforced by local governments from the get-go. So this privileging of local action simply because, or political action simply because it's local, is the probably third and final absurdity of his argument. And so now I'm done with David Ambrosio, my good friend. And on to your central question, which is what do you do about this in an environment where people will say, you know, this is just not going to fly politically, right? My answer to that is, I mean, I don't have a good answer to that. If I had a good answer to that, I'd be probably a lot more famous than I am. I'd be famous, let's put it that way. But let me give you an example of something that just happened in the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities had a program that was created in the late 90s or the early 90s called the Neighborhood Revitalization Program, the NRP program. It got wide notoriety around the country because it devolved decision-making on infrastructure, on community development. It devolved it to the neighborhood level. And neighborhood groups were given responsibility for spending millions of dollars. The city directed tax increment financing funds from their downtown district to neighborhoods. Millions of dollars they dangled in front of these neighborhood groups. It was incredibly progressive. It was studied over and over again. And that was 20 years ago. Now the money's run out. The city wants to think of a different way of doing its business. And one of the things they want to do is analyze what happened in the NRP. Well, when you look at the NRP, as progressive as it was, it directed benefits to white people. Most of the programs that were supported were home ownership programs. In Minneapolis, we have an obscene home ownership gap between whites and non-whites. So if you're benefiting homeowners, you're benefiting white people, right? And what we found in our analysis is that we can't do business the same way NRP did. As progressive as NRP was, it was in fact racially biased. It produced and exacerbated racial inequalities. So the city explicitly indicated that it was going to pursue a racial equity lens in its future relationships with local neighborhood associations. And so my center at the university did an analysis for Minneapolis, and we asked that, what would that look like? What would that look like if the city wanted to establish a racial lens for how it spent its money? And what it would look like is that white neighborhoods are going to get less, and white residents are going to get less. And if you wanted to produce a racial equity approach, and everyone agreed on the principles of it. And so we looked at a formula for disseminating the funds, for distributing the funds based on the BIPOC population of a neighborhood, the rent burden in that neighborhood, and then gentrification in that neighborhood. And on those three factors, which we got people to agree to in principle before they knew what it was going to mean in terms of money, they agreed in the principle on racial equity. They agreed in principle on these factors. And then they found out that white neighborhoods are going to get gored in this process, and they're going to end up with a lot less money than they were getting before, and that this money was being channeled to other parts of the neighborhoods. But it was too late for them to oppose. It was they had agreed in principle, they had agreed to the overall guidelines, and that left them much less maneuvering room for opposing the specific items. Now, some of them did oppose it, but by then the die was cast. Sorry, I almost screwed up my metaphor there. The die was cast, and it was too late. And so now we have unanimous adoption by the city council of this new formula that will produce a radically different distribution of benefits along racial lines, or along racial ethnic lines. And we're talking millions of dollars annually in the city. So now, that's in Minneapolis and not in, Mobile, Alabama, or Little Rock, Arkansas. I get that. I understand that. But I think the sort of the general approach, is one that might provide a way past some of the concerns that you're talking about. And I guess the bottom line is, you don't that kind of agreement on racial equity is necessary up front, because it doesn't happen without somebody giving up advantages. See, I just did it myself. I didn't use the word white people, right? Or the phrase white people. Somebody's going to have to give up advantages. White people are going to have to give up advantages. White neighborhoods are going to have to give up those unfair advantages that they have been experiencing for the last 130 years. There's just no way around that.
Other questions? Well, I have, there might be other questions, but, I have a question. It seems like, just in terms of political feasibility, let's call it, or political possibility. I mean, in some sense, it seems like a more kind of reformist position, which I'm not advocating for, but I could see, you have this process of kind of racial rents that have been, generated for, well over a century. It seems like the policy you just described in Minneapolis, St. Paul is you're essentially reducing those rents ex ante. You're not trying to, in some ways, which you can certainly make an argument for, but you're not trying to sort of take previously accrued advantages per se. You're saying, well, moving forward, we're going to attack these racial rents. I mean, does that make sense in a way? I mean, in terms of thinking of it of feasible policy design, or policy design that would be, potentially saleable in multiple communities.
Right. I think that is a good way of thinking of it, and it's true. It's redistribution. It's rather than a fundamental dismantling that system that established it. Now, the city of Minneapolis also went forward on abolishing single-family zoning, which is a step closer to, I think, what you were talking about as well, in terms of changing changing systems. But yeah, I mean, I think, when people talk about reparations, there are all sorts of different ways of doing it. There's recognition, there's symbolic reparations, but there are material reparations. Material reparations usually involve redistribution, compensation, those types of things, rather than the kind of fundamental restructuring. And so I think that probably is, as you describe, a way into this process as well.
Yeah, I mean, just another sort of a tool like that. I mean, some people have talked about, if you can identify neighborhoods that are subject to gentrification pressures, you immediately impose a tax increment finance mechanism or whatever, and all the money goes to trying to preserve existing affordable housing or build new affordable housing, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, that it would intrinsically probably have a kind of racial dimension, but anyway.
Right, and also, I mean, the planning decisions we make in transportation about where lines go, where stops are, where service is extended, what that service is like, what it costs, right? All of these can be analyzed from a racial equity lens as well, and frequently are, and more frequently are now. And I think part of what planners can do on a day-to-day basis is to make this analysis more routine, more visible, so that it becomes more deeply embedded into the way that we simply think about things as we go forward making plans, right? I mean, day-to-day planners aren't going to be asserting a whiteness framework in day one, right? But there are things that that can be done to adjust the way that planners go about their business. So,
Other questions? Aves.
Thank you, Dr. Orton. Thank you, Dr. Goetz, for being here. This is a great conversation. So I had a question. I feel like, talked a little bit about this before as well, but, we talk about gentrification so much and we focus really on areas where gentrification is happening, and we focus on working class neighborhoods and communities of color where we're seeing people being displaced. And at the same time, we're honestly not having a conversation about the places where people are not being displaced. And I think those are very interlinked conversations, right? Goes back to the exclusionary zoning conversation, because the pressure is being shifted somewhere else to where people get displaced and where new people live. How do we as planners sort of really have a more deeper conversation about that and really get that conversation going? That gentrification is not really about where it is happening today, but also where we're not seeing that pressure, and how those come together and how those move forward in terms of how we address this issue.
yeah. That's a good question. Another good question I don't have a good answer to. Except for the fact that the more work we do on gentrification, the more complex we understand the process to be, and I think that complexities are often difficult to deal with in planning processes, in policy processes, where people do want simplified scenarios. And I think as planners, the people who inform the decision makers, I think it's incumbent upon us to present that complexity, right? I mean, I think this should be part of the analysis that planners provide to decision makers. I think the real question is how we accomplish that with rushed timeframes, scarce resources to do the kind of analysis, or even the kind of engagement processes that would be necessary to make that happen. Again, I don't have a good answer other than this kind of incrementalist response that I gave to the previous one, which is that we do it by starting tomorrow, right? By doing what we can tomorrow and more of it the next day until it becomes the norm, until it becomes really expected in the kind of work that we do. I'm looking at the chat right now. The formula that the racial equity program did in Minneapolis was literally, I'll get it for you, but it's the BIPOC population is the percentage non-white counts for 50%. The percentage of households who are cost burdened is 30% of the allocation or formula, and then the gentrification counts for 20%, and for that, they relied on a study that my center did 3 years earlier on gentrification in Minneapolis, and it was exactly the study that Eve's identified as problematic, because we looked at where places had changed. And in fact, we were using ACS data, so it was, it was already a couple of years out of date. But we had we used several different indicators of gentrification, and were able to identify of those gentrification eligible neighborhoods in Minneapolis, which ones had actually been changing in ways that were consistent with gentrification. So so they used it. Oh, looks like you found it even before I asked. Okay.
Other questions?
You have another question, Eve?
Only if there's no other folks who have questions, then I'll go ahead and ask that. I want to make sure there's no other questions. And I think just building on, and I think with the understanding Dr. Goetz, and when we talk about these issues, these are all things that are going through my mind. I understand that there's no sort of like simplistic answers that you can give, because these are such complex issues. And I think another one that I've really struggled with is, I'm seeing there's a lot of like simplistic conversation that's become that we should not provide infrastructure or neighborhood improvements in areas because it raises property values and displaces people. So we should not build trains or build new parks or provide better water infrastructure. And there's such a struggle internally with me where we don't want people to be displaced, but at the same time, why would we accept that as a society that some people get to live in low quality neighborhoods with low life quality? Like, why would we accept that as a planning principle? And I think, again, there's no simplistic answers, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, a great question. And very quickly, a story from our study of gentrification. We didn't just do a quantitative analysis, we did a qualitative analysis as well, asking residents about changes in their neighborhoods. And I remember very vividly African-American woman from the north side of Minneapolis, the heart of the African-American community in Minneapolis, complaining about the fact that a city crew just came by and picked up an old abandoned mattress from behind her house, the alley behind her house. And we wondered why she complained about that. And it was because she saw that as an outgrowth of gentrification, that mattress had been there for 8 years. And the city didn't give a damn about it when the neighborhood was predominantly Black. But now that it's starting to see influx of gentrifiers and whites, Now you've got city crews coming by and cleaning up. And so it had nothing, of course, obviously, to do with the mattress and the disorder. It had to do with the fact that these services only come with white people or bring white people. And I think that's what you were referring to about the infrastructure. And that's certainly the case when people think about light rail lines or transportation infrastructure, park infrastructure, to be sure. But this also gets back to the first question about new housing. And it's all part of the same phenomenon, which is how do we make these improvements? How do we do this kind of development without enhancing displacement pressures? And the fact of the matter is that as long as there are land markets, we can't. That those displacement pressures will occur. That's a market response. What we can do is to try to protect against them to the greatest extent possible, so that when we do build new affordable housing, we make sure that we couple that, or rather, when we do build housing, we make sure that we couple with that protections for existing affordable housing. When we improve parks, we couple that with protections for affordable housing. When we do anything, we couple it with protections for affordable housing to keep people, to enhance the potential for people to remain in neighborhoods where the market is making it more difficult. Now, I mean, that's my response to that. It's not a perfect response because it doesn't get at what people call the in-place displacement. I mean, the loss of one's community around you as you stay in it, right? And that's a problem for which I don't have any answer at all. That kind of political displacement, social displacement as well, requires a different set of concerns and considerations.
Liz, is that
No, I have.
That's your old question.
No, I have another question.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, we're losing some people to a competing event that's just started up on climate justice. So it's not you. It's we somehow we have so many things happening these days. But I had a question. I was looking at the racial equity framework on your website, and one of the sections is about community engagement. So I wonder if you could talk at all about that, because that seems, I mean, that kind of goes to the heart of the NIMBY thing, and by enabling these neighborhood processes, are you just advantaging neighborhoods that are well organized and have the capacity to, be heard? Right. So how is that used in this framework?
Sure. So one of the elements of racial inequity that was identified by the city, and frankly, they had a lot of help from BIPOC advocates on this, was that the neighborhood associations themselves were unrepresentative of the communities where they operated. So they didn't have renters, right? They didn't have people of color, and their boards were not at all reflective of the communities. And so the city included that as part of this racial equity lens. It's not just about moving money in different ways, but it is about taking steps and being accountable for how inclusive your organization is and its success in that. And we all know the difficulties of making these organizations inclusive. We all know about the biases of participation that work in the direction of home ownership, of affluence, and therefore of whiteness, right? But the city said, all of that notwithstanding, you may end up suffering budgetarily if you and your board don't look like the neighborhood. right? And so it built in this, the engagement part of it, and expected a great deal more of communities. I'm afraid I can't be any more detailed or specific than that. It's not something that I've spent a lot of time looking at, but that was definitely an element of their of the framework itself.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question. Anybody? Okay, well, if nobody has another question, you know, it's getting pretty close to the end, so we could wrap things up. And thanks so much, Ed. It was terrific. Really interesting talk. And I'm sure your article will be widely read. Oh, is there? Oh, that's a clap of the hands. Anyway, thanks a lot, Ed. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for all the great questions.
Yeah. Okay.